Hello, and welcome to Supply Chain Next. I'm your host, Richard Donaldson. Join me as we explore the ongoing evolution of supply chain, from the challenges practitioners face every day to the ongoing digital transformation of the entire value network. All right, and welcome to the next episode of Supply Chain Next. This is Richard Donaldson, and I am here with Stan Aronow. Aronow, it's Aronow, right? Aronow, okay, all right, just got it on there.
Aronow, yeah.
Stan Aronow, all right, so because the ARO, I'm like, Aronow. Anyway, but Stan from Gartner here, we're going to get into his background here for a little bit. Really super pleasure to have him here. His perspective on what's going on in the world of supply chain, I think, is incredibly unique, and just want to get into it and welcome Stan.
Yeah, thanks so much, Richard. Great to be here.
Very cool. And you today are in, if I remember correctly, Colorado.
Yep, I'm currently in Fort Collins, Colorado.
Oh, right on. Cool. Okay. All right. Well, let's dive right into it, Stan. You and I have got some similar, interesting, oddly enough, kind of similarities. I think you sort of grew up in the Midwest and then found yourself at university. Let's tell everyone a little bit about the start of Stan, where you came from and kind of how you got into got into where you're going.
I'll spare you the early days, but
okay.
Most of my formative years were spent in Michigan, in the Detroit area.
Okay.
And if I look at sort of the on-ramp to what I eventually am doing now, I decided there's a couple of really good state schools in Michigan. There's University of Michigan and Michigan State. My wife went to Michigan State, so I'm equal opportunity. Both are great at supply chain. I think state probably ranks a little bit better, actually. Yep. But I decided at the time that I was going to go to business school. I was going to do finance and accounting.
Okay.
And so for me, it was, I think I hadn't really figured everything out yet. I don't have the view that I have now. It was more, I always liked math. I had a fascination with the investment community and what it did. And so that was sort of what steered me in that direction initially.
No, right on. So now kind of go back and replay that a little bit. But so you originally thought finance, kind of went down the financial path, started thinking, an MBA or something. Maybe I'm going to go work on Wall Street. At that time, was supply chain even a concept in your head?
Oh, geez. I graduated in the early 90s. So supply chain, I don't even know, wasn't a term. People worked in like logistics and, they bought stuff and things like that. So I would say at that point in time, no.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, as I've thought about it a little bit more, I went to business school, but you could take electives. So I used to like taking eclectic types of courses. I took like anatomy, physiology in the medical school. I took astronomy, and if I try to draw a thread, because I'm an analyst by nature, those are actually domains that require systems thinking, and I think that's where supply chain's rich. So I was probably destined to go down some path that had some sort of systems thinking in it. You mentioned the investment thing. Fun fact, I actually interviewed with Bear Stearns in New York City. Oh. Culturally, I was like, nah, I don't want to go into this place. And oh my God, am I so glad that I didn't? Because obviously, we know the rest of the story of what happened with the whole meltdown.
Absolutely. What's interesting that you also point out, because it's a concept that's now coming, I don't know if it's coming full circle or getting more prominence now, but systems level thinking and what that means, right? Yes. And I'm going to bookmark that and come back to that because I think it's an important concept when applied to supply chain, and certainly the path towards a transparent global supply chain, right? You have to start thinking system-wide versus the discrete parts. But hold on for that one sec, because you had a little brief stint, I think, upon graduation, and then you ended up at this little company people might have heard of called Intel.
Yes.
And had a pretty good run there too. And from what I gather, that point or that part of your career was the transition from finance into supply chain. Let's talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, this is, again, kind of funny that maybe supply chain has a big magnet attached to it for me, because I actually interviewed with both finance and supply chain coming out of grad school. So I moved to Arizona for grad school, and the finance one was a better offer, what it's worth at the time. And so I ended up, entering the company that way. But interestingly enough, I was finance for supply chain.
Okay. So and what did that mean at the time? What did that role mean?
Uh, it was some of it was just sort of your standard financial planning and analysis and making sure everyone was staying on budget and things like that. But I started branching into projects. So that was it was interesting that the late 90s, early 2000s, for those who were, in the workforce, that was the dot-com era.
Right.
And so there was this thing called e-business that everyone was talking about, and it was the biggest thing, and lots of money was flowing to it. And so I actually was doing a lot of financial analysis to say, do we want to go invest in this? And apparently I gave the program manager leading that transformation program such a hard time that, he either decided maybe I have, some potential, or maybe he wanted to, take me out of his way. He said, hey, would you like a job?
Right.
Yeah, actually, that sounds really interesting. And so that was like, e-supplier types of capabilities, e-procurement.
Yeah. Well, let me double click on that for a second, because there's certain companies that I think inherently had amazing supply chains, and I think Intel's one of those. And you were there at a time when they may or may not have known they had an amazing supply chain, right? Because we today, supply chain's top of mind for everybody. Back then, kind of as you put it, and even coming out of school, you're like, ooh, finance, supply chain, I'm going to go finance. And honestly, I think 10 out of 10 people would have made that choice back then, because supply chain was sort of in the background a little bit, even though they were one of the top supply chain companies in the world, and maybe they just took it for granted. Can you speak to that for a little bit? Like, how did you start to get introduced to supply chain, especially at a company like Intel? And then what were some of the moments that you had and like, oh my gosh, this is bigger than even potentially finance is? Or what were your thoughts at that time?
If I'm thinking about it, like from the perspective of someone who's deciding to go into a career, from a corporate perspective, I actually think finance was a great place to start, just because you come in, you attach at a very senior level relative to where you're coming from, and you get a view, like an end-to-end view of the business. And, to be honest, you figure out how stuff gets funded.
Right.
And that's a really good skill to have, especially, if you're head of supply chain or a COO, they are going to the board asking for significant sums to transform. So, for me, I think that was great as a starting point. These types of transformation programs that I talked about, where it's like, we need to completely rethink how we source and connect out with our suppliers. Because, back then in the late 90s, everything was fairly siloed. The exchange of information, even transactionally between companies, was done more, over email. And, and we're using SharePoint, I think, at the time, like create, and we thought that was really advanced. Right. And then Rosetta Net standards came out and things like that. So what was interesting about moving into the supply chain area is it's not as broad, but you start drilling into the process and really understanding how this works, how complex it is, all the the interplays between the different parties, not just yourself, but how important it is to plan in a coordinated way with your partners. And I found that fascinating. That goes back to the whole systems thing. I was like, this is just a complex ecosystem. And so there's a lot of potential there. I don't think, I don't know if I realized, at least at first, how advanced Intel was, because a lot of times you just sort of live in a bubble. But it's an engineering cultured company, lots of really smart people there. And I think that's the thing about high-tech companies, is they tend to look at problems like supply chain problems as just yet another engineering problem. And so they bring really advanced math to figure out how to optimize and all of that. And you get really interesting things as a result.
So, but interesting on that. So agreed, right? And I certainly could share some more stories in the high-tech circles, but again, we're at Intel. It's an engineering-led culture. They're literally cracking the atom when it comes to creating these incredible, foundational chips that run everything, right? And based on the simplistic level of zeros and ones, which I still to this day just blows my mind, right? It's the binary system that runs the world. It's like, wow. However, somewhere in that period, I think you were there, right? Supply chain kind of gained more and more prominence, because you really came at an interesting period where you saw the rise of the dot-com in the late 90s. And then you continued through early 2010, if I'm reading this right,
Yes.
And there was a big transformation that started happening, not just in the world of the internet, but then Intel's position in that. And I believe during that time, concurrently, supply chain began to take on more prominence. Was that happening? And what were your observations during that period?
It was. I mean, if I'm, I'm several years, more than a decade out of Intel. So
right.
I think I can, just talk about it objectively.
Yeah.
Pre-Intel, known as one of the pioneers in Silicon Valley, and therefore had a lot of market power. And basically, it could not only dictate terms to suppliers, but in many ways to customers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the period that I lived in Intel, it became much more important for supply chain to be really high performing because the customer's voice started mattering more and more. It wasn't just, if we build it, they will come. It was, we need to get to yes much faster. And we need to figure out how to do this in a really effective way. So
and was that pressure coming from? Let me ask again, because I was sort of tangentially related. I was in parallel. It's interesting you bring this up because you're I think referring to kind of what we know now as sort of the cloud providers, right? So this is the Googles and the Microsofts and Facebook, and I was sort of early there at eBay, but all these high tech companies started buying more and more servers, which was more and more chips. And then eventually, led by Google and Microsoft and Amazon, they started diving into the supply chain going, well, we're going to build our own servers. Oh, heck, we'll build our own routers. Oh, heck, let's build our own chips, right? And I remember this because I literally was on meetings with Intel reps when I was at eBay, and we were designing chips. We're way past, like, hey, just give us whatever you want to give us. Like there were certain workloads we had to define. So that's an interesting pressure that started happening that forced a look at the supply chain to be more reactive, adaptive. Like you couldn't drive the market anymore. The market started driving Intel.
Yes. And it happened over, several years because all of that customization that customers were doing that you described, that really even accelerated post my departure in 2010.
Yeah. Big time.
It was just becoming much more, much higher customer requirements, from the Dells and the HPs and Lenovo's of the worlds. Now it's, we don't even want your, full stack. We want something hybrid. We want other IP outside of yours and other manufacturing technologies, which for Intel, the amazing thing was just how vertically integrated it was. Everything, the technology, the factories, everything was owned internally, and that was the secret sauce. And now they have to be, really disaggregated to be able to run a bunch of different models. So the complexity shot through the roof.
Yeah, totally. And okay. So then that opens you to supply chain. You get, a fascinating, as you said, the internet, when it's through its first kind of, hype cycle in the late 90s, right? Then it imploded sort of 2000, 2001. And then it came back up and it's just continued to climb ever since, right? Mm-hmm. But you also then made a jump to go from Intel to Gartner. What, talk about that. Like that's a pretty big leap from a practitioner, big name company to now I'm going to go into and do the research that sits on top of all this stuff. And you started in, if I'm not mistaken, supply chain right away.
Yes. Yeah. So I had spent most of my time, in and around supply chain at Intel. And, in my earlier years, it was, mostly with the sourcing function. And then I started supporting planning. And then it started becoming, transformation programs that were end to end across all of supply chain. So right around the end of my tenure, like 2007, 2008, I ran into this company called AMR Research, which many have heard of. It's the predecessor basically to the group of supply chain analysts that are now at Gartner. I instantly was like smitten. I was like, this is just the coolest thing, being able to go out and be part of a larger community and share best practices and learn. And so I just sort of took it on my own as a hobby to say, I'll take over this contract. I'm going to work the relationship between all these analysts in the community and those who are across all the different parts of the supply chain at Intel. And so for a little while, I was just sort of doing that. And I was enthusiastic. So they were like, oh, you're such a great customer. we really like, the connections that you're making, between what we do and, what Intel is doing. And Intel, like you said, lots to share with the community because it's a fairly advanced supply chain. So at some point, the high-tech supply chain role comes open at AMR, turning into Gartner shortly after. And they said, well, we obviously don't poach from customers, but, if you know anyone who's interested, wink, wink, let them know to apply. And, that's sort of how I started.
Interesting.
Coming in as an industry analyst, covering high tech more broadly.
And maybe because I actually didn't know that. I knew of AMR, but that's an interesting little factoid. So I didn't realize Gartner, well, also with you, went out and, of course, acquired a certain group, the AMR, that actually was kind of their emphasis was. So everything we see in supply chain today, is that Christian and all the other analysts that kind of came out of that group, or?
So we added to that group. I was I was part of a team of 15 to 20 analysts.
Oh, right on.
Now it's like 100 to 150 analysts in supply chain, and we've added CEB analysts. And SCM world. Yeah.
Let's double click on that, because that parallels again the growth of supply chain, and Gartner obviously is a reflection of everything that's going on in the world, right? I mean, they've cemented themselves sort of with the magic quadrants and everything, but more specifically, though, at the time, and you may not have been aware of it, but do you have any insights? Like, what was at that time? Because 2010 was, I would contend, sort of early vision around supply chain importance coming up 10 years later, right? Yes. Were they that mindful at that time strategically about building that practice? Because that's a pretty amazing ahead of the curve kind of thing, and what was the thinking at that point? And what was the early days with that group and how you were looking at supply chain?
Oh, geez. I mean, I think it was a strategic purchase.
Wow, that's amazing.
They you have to look at it. It's almost like a whale swallowed a minnow.
Yeah, right. But very specific minnow. Yeah. But that minnow grew into something.
That minnow grew, and actually, it's one of the fastest growing businesses within Gartner today. What I can tell you, just looking at the numbers, they're crazy good right now.
Right.
And it's really grown, and I think it's viewed as not only a strategic part of the business, but as a best practice for what we can do with the rest of the business, which, Gartner is, our ticker symbol is IT. So
right.
A lot is focused on the CIO and, everyone who works for the CIO. But I think what we do really well, which ties to what I mentioned before, is it's the relationships and community and learning across. That's what I think, a lot is coming out of that.
Well, and that's, I think, to jump in on that, right? So, and your function, interestingly enough, and you've been there for close to 13 years, 12 years, or whatever it is now, it looks, if I'm not mistaken, like it's kind of stayed pretty similar. Like you've stayed kind of in this role that keeps you connected to a certain Fortune 500 client base, and you're interacting with them on what's kind of going on with supply chain. Is that kind of a reflection of what you've been doing, or is it how has your role changed over 10 years or 12 years?
Yeah, it's I started with my primary focus was high tech, but being you can take the guy out of finance, but you can't take the finance out of the guy. So I covered other topics like cost to serve is very popular, in especially nowadays with the inflation that's going on. So I covered that as a topic, for instance. But there was this other thing called the Supply Chain Top 25, which many are familiar with. That's our leadership research to say who's really pushing the envelope as far as being advanced at running supply chain, a broader value chain, really advanced digital capabilities. And I was always fascinated with that. Going back to my Intel days, I was actually one of the ones who was, kind of beating a drum within the company to say, we need to pay attention to this. We want to actually get on the list prominent, the very top of it, because this will attract and retain talent.
Yep.
And that's actually, the way a lot of companies look at it. So I've actually been involved with that program since those days. So it's almost, most of the program. And that actually is a great program to get you visibility into what's going on at all these larger Fortune 500 companies who are more advanced.
Totally. Has there been so let me kind of again double click on that with that perspective, and certainly with that time arc. I mean, and I'm going to test your memory again here, like going back 10 years, what were people talking about with respect to supply chain then? versus what they're talking about now? I mean, it's sort of the high level, right? Because it has evolved a lot, right? And you've got such an interesting perspective on that evolution. So what? Yeah,
I would say, geez, so much to say here. So the reason why the top 25 was originally created, and we still talk about this, we wanted to elevate the role of the profession. It used to be, it's like, oh, you're just about like kicking boxes and licking labels and slapping them on the boxes, somewhere in the bowels of in operations. And just do your job.
No one knows who you are.
Right. Just do it. Just do your job over there. Now, we've seen it come to fruition. Like we were seeing even before the pandemic, supply chain, head of supply chain was reporting to the CEO at many of these companies, was becoming a partner for growth at these companies. Now it's like the pandemic happened. And of course, like for good and bad reasons, everyone knows what supply chain is. It's on everyone's lips. And so, it's pretty much, it's part of the zeitgeist of our community, on what it is. But we basically have sort of achieved what we originally set out to do if you go back to those early days. But if you were to look at the vast majority of companies, Gartner likes maturity models. And, if you talk about the 5-stage maturity model for just the overall, kind of what's the objective of the supply chain? How does it operate? You go through this evolution where it starts off really siloed. And then it becomes more integrated end to end, and then eventually integrated out with the value chain and a broader ecosystem. And, for these larger companies, they orchestrate what happens in those ecosystems as far as the products, as far as now, pushing for greater sustainability and, ethical sourcing and things like that. And so that really was a big part of what we were trying to accomplish. And actually the top 25 was a big vehicle. So I stayed attached to that program and ended up running it for 5 years. And I'm still involved with it, as part of the advisory board, that runs the program.
Oh, right on. So, and let me kind of triple click in this for a sec. Now, well, one question I guess I have is a very obvious one. Is the top 25 changed, or is it very similar cohort as it was 10 years ago? Or have you seen a lot of people move in and out of it?
So the way you get in it, as far as qualifying it, it's always been larger companies,
Yeah, right. But has it been the same 25 companies that have sort of led that charge?
But what I would say is there's a fair amount of stability, in some cases, like if you look at like a Johnson & Johnson, a P&G, like these are companies that sort of consistently, and Intel's been in that, they've been in the top 10 for the last decade. The way we evaluate leadership has changed, and it's interesting to see. It's sort of, it's a chicken and egg. What's evolved? So one of the things that I did back in like 2015 timeframe is I said, we need to add, at the time we were calling it corporate social responsibility. Now it's referred to as environmental, social, and governance, CSG. We need a way to, in a quantitative way, show what these different companies are doing. How good are they at this? Because this is becoming more and more important for supply chain. We were previously just looking at financial performance. And so that's actually driven the conversation. If you talk about what's hot in supply chain now, ESG is right up front. Digital transformation obviously continues as well.
And so within that too, and I'm going to go back to the concept you talked about very early on, which is system level thinking, right? So what I don't want to gloss over is somewhere along this journey, both your time at Gartner, probably within these top 25, supply chain companies, and just industry wide, is the move from the disaggregate pieces of supply chain, procurement, asset management, disposition, finance, maybe planning, whatever else you want to kind of throw into the hopper. But they all were kind of different groups, but somewhere it became the supply chain organization. But oddly to say this, that's a new-ish system level view of supply chain. Can you talk to that? Because somewhere in the last few years that changed, right? I mean, you must have seen it again from your perspective. When did that happen?
I would say, I started as an analyst in 2010, and it's still a mix, but it was definitely a mix that was more skewed toward a lower level of reporting for that head of supply chain. And then also, if you looked at the scope of what was under the role of supply chain, some companies, if you say, well, hey, who's your head of supply chain and what do they own? They'd say it's so-and-so. and they own planning and logistics.
Right. Right.
And it's like they're using the same term, but it's still fairly narrow.
Right.
Into the 20 teens,
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's where we started really seeing companies say, you know what, we need to optimize overall end to end for our supply response.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to put everything under one leader.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the scope and the importance of that role, it was elevated up in some cases to the C-suite, to an executive type of role. What I would say, just as a general trend that we're seeing, now I'm sort of getting into the position I'm in right now, where I support the community of CEOs and global chief supply chain officers, is I call it the expansionist, CSCO.
Okay.
It's not that you only own just the plans, all the SCORE functions, right? Plan, source, make, deliver, return, and all that, and service. It's that you also likely own sustainability, or you have a really strong influence on what happens there, including broader ESG, which would include things like diversity, equity, inclusion, because supply chain often employs most of the people, in these companies.
Right.
And then we're also seeing things come in around them owning the digitization aspect of it. Some are joint CIOs, or at a minimum own the supply chain IT function, and that's under their purview.
Yep.
Or something around products. Some of our members are actually in charge of product design, or key component of product launch. So what I would say is, in the old days, if you were to say, getting into supply chain, is this a potential path to the corner office? The answer would come back, maybe, but not that often. You look at Tim Cook, for instance, came through in operations type of background.
Totally.
And he ended up in the role he's in now at Apple, but it was more the exception versus the rule. I think we're going to see more and more CEOs with supply chain backgrounds moving forward.
So at a high level, knowing what you know today, now let's kind of start to maybe look forward, or someone who's outside of the top 25, maybe they're the top 50 or 100 or something like that. How do you describe the elements of what goes into a supply chain organization, right? At a very simplistic level, right? Because I think that's also kind of I'll let you answer it, but I mean, there's pieces, and you referred to them, right? In that whole continuum, and it ends up being the business within the business, because it's, it starts at sort of the buying procurement, but then there's a bunch of stuff in the middle as the assets kind of moving through. And then you also, which a lot of people forget about, is you have to get rid of this stuff. And this gets back to circularity, environmentalism, disposition. I'm going to come back to that one, because that's a topic. Jump into that in a second.
That's a rich one.
Yeah. But anyway, so how do you, someone comes to you and says, okay, I'm in the Fortune 2000, but what element should I have in the supply chain? And kind of my leading question here is, because I'm also seeing the way y'all are looking at supply chain as a category is no longer these piece parts, but one global category with a bunch of, with pieces, but they're all supply chain pieces now, right?
Yeah. There are, like I said, there's varying definitions that we see across different companies. There tends to be a correlation where more mature companies tend to have broader purviews. So you might have a group that's more facing demand creation, even, or the demand planning function. Sure. We are seeing some supply chains play a larger role in customer experience. Because it's interesting. You do see a lot of engineering types of people go into supply chain. So the data scientists, that's a great type of skill set to have if you wanted to even analyze what's going on with unstructured data tied to your customer, what they want in terms of your products, what the demand profile, looks like currently, and what it might be projected to look like. And so if you ask the question, who's better to actually do your forecasting? Is it your commercial team or your supply chain team? Well, your commercial team, of course, is a huge player and has a lot of say in it, but supply chain might actually have the core underlying skills. So I would even start with that. Like on the demand side, there's a role that supply chain plays there. So traditionally, supply has been, the big part of the role is supply chain, but I think it's actually extended beyond that. I think, to your point, it also extends into the product as well. There's lots of discussions we're having now about design for supply chain. Design for many outcomes. Right now, it's how do we actually design products so that we can get the most out of the capacity that we have, because we're really, really constrained, whether it's our own facilities or what we're getting in as supply. But then there's also the piece that you mentioned, which I think we'll probably hit separately, around the whole circular model.
Right.
How do you design this thing so that it's not cradle to grave, but cradle to cradle?
Right.
And you can actually bring some of the resources back in, and that's going to be more sustainable for how we run our businesses moving forward, not just a thing that's good for the planet.
Well, I think you open the door, so I will walk through the question. It's a collaborative. So this is one, and it's certainly one I learned early on, where everyone focuses on the buying stuff. So you got huge procurement teams and these elaborate RFP, RFQs, and all my demand planning goes into it. And then even in my asset management, it's kind of like, all right, there's still a big team, relatively speaking, and they keep track of it because there's a bunch of stuff, got a bunch of depreciation you got to worry about, yada, yada, yada. But then we get to the disposition. And for me, that's where things fall off the cliff to this day, where I'm like, wait a minute, you buy $250 billion worth of stuff, right? If you're Chevron per year, right? And this Fortune 2000 buys $12 trillion worth of stuff per year, by the way, right? So it's a pretty massive number of acquisition.
Right.
But there's no emphasis on the disposition side. That's a new, interestingly kind of topic. And for me, it's a lot of free cash for companies and CFOs. Forget the sustainability recycling aspect of it. That's free money, right? That's sitting there.
It is.
Yeah.
Some requires some effort to unlock it. So like if you're talking about something that really needs to be designed to unlock components or even like minerals, you look at one of the stories, we have an awards program, Power of the Profession. A couple of years ago, Dell won, and Dell's taking gold out of motherboards. There's actually more gold by weight in a motherboard than there is in like gold ore that you would see in rocks out in nature.
Wow.
So that's a little brute force, right? In some cases, taking it out. If you were to design something where you were like, well, 60% of this thing, I hate to use the word commodity, but it's not like the latest IP, the latest technology. It could be the same. Why don't we figure out how to cycle those components from our old product back into that, and then we'll just create the new stuff. But you have to start at the very beginning of the line to say, let's do it that way. Let's actually make it so that we have a system, including the reverse logistics and the quality management inbound, to be able to bring that back in.
And I think that's so. Again, let me double click on that. Ironically, the disposition side seems to be like a new opportunity for supply chains to optimize. So from your perspective, what are people talking about when they think about this process, this disposition? Of course, designing so that circular is one thing, and that's actually forward thinking. I'd give a lot of credit to an organization that's thinking along those terms. Yeah. Is it, from your end, what do you see the companies starting to wake up to? Because they have a lot of stuff. I mean, that same 2,000 companies is sitting on, based on book value, $187 trillion worth of assets. I mean, it's a ridiculous amount of stuff.
Yeah. And I think, the motivations come from different places. In some cases, it's, this asset that is, gathering dust might actually have some residual value to it. And to your point, it's just sitting there waiting to be monetized. And so let's figure out a way to do that. Oh, by the way, when we do that, that's good for the environment. At the same time. So, we can, raise the flag on that as well. There's others where I think there are pure environmental concerns. So if you look at the community that, I currently support, there's a lot of consumer packaged good companies in there. So you think about plastic, all those statistics that get thrown out, there's more plastic in the ocean now by weight than fish, which is, if you really think about that, it's incredible and gross at the same time.
Totally.
And so there's pressure on how do we, not use plastic in the first place for our packaging, but where it really makes sense, because it's a great solution. It's almost like Freon for cooling. It's like, how do we actually try to recreate this thing that was really good, but
it doesn't
for the environment.
Right.
And so the discussions are starting to go toward, how do we reach as a community common standards?
Sure.
So, and that's actually, it sounds boring when you start talking about standards, but where this is critical is once you have a standard, everyone can use it. And you can actually get economies of scale. Because if you look at the economics today of plastic, for instance, that would go into a package for a consumer good company, it actually is less expensive. I don't know what the current price of oil, but generally speaking, it's less expensive to create virgin plastic than to have it go through the whole recycling process. And so going back to the concept of a system or an ecosystem, you need everyone involved. You need all the consumers of that to agree and say, if it's this type of packaging, we're all going to use the same thing or the same platform and ingredients. By the way, we need to pull in the chemical companies and we need to pull in the recycling companies. We need to create these markets jointly together so that we flip the economics of this to make it work. And that's what I'm seeing right now are some of the discussions that we're having in the community. And it's encouraging. It's hard to do.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of these where I think one can attribute a little bit of out of sight, out of mind, because something's been bought, used, and kind of like it's over here, but it's actually coming back through because they've bought so much of it, right? But then secondly, again, we kind of go back to systems level view, right? Where we're starting to connect the dots between stuff we're pulling out of the ground, right? Like the system level view I keep referring to, I think you and I talked about this, is that Robert Kunzing infographic in that National Geographic article where he shows the world supply chain, 106 gigatons of stuff. You probably know Robert because he's a pretty famous, area in the circular economy kind of thing. But my point here is that, what we take out of the ground, again, it's actually a list that's not that long. I could probably fire off 80 to 90% of the stuff that we use today comes from about a dozen or 2 dozen materials at the end of the day, right? And so if we start connecting the dots with how those materials go through and are manufactured and then recycled again, we can begin to avoid pulling stuff out of the ground if we look at that full system view. But that takes, again, you got to think system wide, not just this little piece here. I'm just disposing of something. Yeah.
You do. And the other thing I would say that sometimes can be a barrier is actually geopolitics. And so that's another wrinkle, and it's actually another reason why I think heads of supply chain are well suited to, move into CEO types of roles, because you're dealing with influence of governmental policy. You look at what's going on in high tech and in pharma right now. Lots of discussions around building national specific supply chains where there's traceability for the products and so on and so forth. So, I thought of it, I branched off into this one, just thinking about like rare earths, the majority are, refined in China right now. And, lots of talk about decoupling in our economies, between the West and China. Not that it's happening or that it's fully happened by any stretch. But that's on a lot of people's mind right now is where do we go from here?
But that's a fascinating point though, right? That's a fascinating point is inherently, again, supply chain practitioners, especially at the global multinational level, also are diplomats. They have to be because they're going and negotiating and actually changing policies within countries. So, their knowledge base isn't just optimization or constraints theory. It's what's the current geopolitical landscape that I'm walking into, and how do I negotiate something that's compatible to not only our corporate goals, but now our sustainability goals, and be congruent with this country's geopolitical stuff going on.
Yes, there's just so much. It's like 3D or 4D chess or whatever we would want to call it. But like a lot of our members, they've said, "Hey, I'm not available in the early November timeframe because I'm getting ready, or I'm going to be at the COP26 talks going on in Scotland," and so they're right in the thick of it. And it's actually important that they shape the language that gets written because they don't want it to happen to them and have bureaucrats create some language that's actually not executable, on their part. So that's another big part of the leader's role is to,
That's a fascinating point. Very fascinating. Okay, I'm going to switch gears slightly. Let's just talk tech for a sec, because I have to talk about technology. But this is another one where you've also had an interesting purview from your perspective on how technologies have begun to evolve to adapt to now a supply chain in a holistic view, right? 10 or 15 years ago, I'm not even sure there really was supply chain technology as much as technologies for the pieces of the supply chain, or people jerry-rigged certain solutions, that were pre-existing, that maybe There's a big financial system that we all know that every company has, and that became the supply chain platform, even though it was never really a supply chain platform. But now that's different. I mean, now in the last few years, you've seen an onslaught of new technologies that are actually, I would call them now supply chain technologies. Maybe just a perspective on that kind of evolution that you've seen.
Oh, geez. Yeah, it's huge over the last decade, let's say. If I go back to like the early 2010s, it's exactly as you said. And this actually has direct parallels to the maturity model that I was talking about before, where you start off in a really siloed way.
Yep.
You're siloed off from your product organization and from your commercial organization, but even within yourself, if yourself is what we would define now as supply chain, it's like everyone's in their slice trying to optimize what they do. And so, of course, they would each go off and say, well, if I need to optimize procurement, sourcing, I need to optimize manufacturing, I need to optimize logistics, I need my own tool, and it lives within its own ecosystem.
Yep.
Right around that time, we started seeing an opening up around data analytics, and just because of hyperscale, type of computing capabilities, that actually became possible to solve and optimize across end-to-end, for instance. Technologies that allowed you to get visibility to assets in the field, whether that's a shipment or a piece of equipment or whatever, that type of telemetry started becoming possible, affordable, technologically feasible at that time. And so the foundational pieces started coming together to manage. I still believe you have to have the the process maturity to be able to pull that off. Because if you're still kind of acting this way in silos, it doesn't matter. Someone could give you the most advanced tool and you bastardize it.
Totally.
For the more advanced companies that have gotten there and sort of crossed the chasm, absolutely. And if you look at what happened when the pandemic hit in 2020, those were the companies that were able to actually really be surgical in their responses and be successful. And no one could have predicted all the stuff that happened. So it was really about how do we have really good visibility. I remember a story from one of our members that's in the auto industry, and he was talking about having visibility to key components at a tier 2 supplier just as the border was closing on one of these countries. As we saw the movement of the virus from place to place, and they got a special dispensation to go grab a bunch of components, which really helped them. There's no way they would have had, that's a really tactical example, but there's no way they would have had the ability to be that precise in what they did if they didn't have a system of record that gave them that level of visibility. And that's not just 4 walls, that's now going out, 2 tiers upstream in the supply chain. So I think that's the big thing. I also see digital as being an enabler for a bunch of things. We talk about all the sustainability, circular economy. I think you need digital to enable that. You would need to have a system that says, not only do I have so much of the new component that I'm making, I also have half of what I'm going to put into your production that's being recycled coming from a bunch of disparate sources from existing customers.
Totally.
So
well, let me. So on that though, and this is where we kind of get into the tech, and I'm curious because there's a symbiotic relationship to some extent between the innovators, the startups, whatever you want to call that community, and then these big behemoths of industry, these top 50, top 100, right, and what they're looking for. So in that conversation, right, and this would be more instructive to the people building the stuff of the future. What's kind of top of mind there? This seems like ironically kind of a new space, right? Like I get asked a lot of times, like, what is a supply chain solution? Like, what does that look like? I don't even know how to define that because I've never actually seen it before. I know what it does. And, oftentimes I revert to, well, it's the digital twinning of your entire supply chain, right? Now, to the extent that you want to see it, to the example you just gave, it could go all the way to where the materials are actually pulled out of the earth and then refined and manufactured and brought to you and then acquired and then recycled wherever you want it. That's kind of the end game. But let me ask you, like, how are these discussions happening at these giants of industry and how they're viewing what their requirements for supply chain solutions? Or Are they designing their own? Are they looking outside? Are they opening up to the world of startup and innovation? Because it seems like they are.
I would say I actually see more openness to working with startups and innovators that are more bleeding edge in the more advanced, larger players than I would see in the general community.
Interesting.
And that speaks to like the risk profile of the companies. They're leaning forward and saying, and I would actually tie that to just a broader, like agile, adaptive type of culture, which if you don't have that today, you better get it soon because, I don't think it's going to get any less disruptive,
Totally.
For instance. So those companies are willing to place bets. Some of them actually have a side budget that you could put under the banner of general R&D, where they're out talking to the university affiliated organizations and other just startups that are in these hubs, innovation hubs, to say, well, what's new? What's the next thing that we should be focused on? And then they use almost like a venture capital type of approach to say, let's figure out, in a controlled way, what are the winners and what are the losers. And it's only when you get to that final stage that you say, is this something we would want to scale across our entire enterprise versus just being, a pilot that we're doing small scale. And that's where the big money would come in as part of their planning process. But those planning processes are becoming much more adaptive nowadays. Because you think about it, like we just ran an event with a really large home improvement store that went through a dramatic transformation. They needed to execute a roadmap that they had planned for 3 years in one.
Yep.
There's no way you can short circuit that unless you can turn the crank faster. As far as how you fund these things. Totally.
And that's sort of that leads into then. So of these technologies or things that they're kind of focusing on, is there some kind of, well, let me ask a question. There's another issue, another transformation that's happening, which is the movement from, and this is more techie now for a second, but the movement from enterprises historically have been, I'll say, notorious for buying their own software and then turning it into something that does not resemble what they originally purchased. That's an age-old enterprise practice.
Been there, done that.
Yeah, right. We've all seen it. And it is. I mean, it's a Frankenstein that emerges, and you can't kill it, and it ends up being the backbone. And we all have our war stories in that one. But the point or the question I'm getting to is now, though, it's kind of moving into this whole platform world, right? And we've had Jeff Parker on the show, and we talked about platform revolution. But it's almost like the whole IT world of enterprises concurrently shifting their IT strategy from retained to own software to platforms of platforms. Like I'm going to run all my, where Salesforce is a platform that runs the sales and marketing team within an organization, or Workday runs HR within an organization. But it's really attacking one of the big, I'll call them, kind of fears of enterprises, is somehow in a shared system, their data is going to get lost and corrupted and security and yada, yada. But that's going away. So my question is inherently there, like, how does that affect now the supply chain in particular, as they're looking at solutions and really platforms are the way to go versus owning software? Is that how does that come up with you or group or your thoughts?
I think we're in the middle of the journey right now. There's still some that I hear from that, they have the concerns about, the security, the reliability and all that of moving, most of their, critical, capabilities to that type of platform. I think ultimately though, we will get there. And what that enables, ultimately, if you look at this is kind of drawing on a concept that other people have talked about, but it's not going to be companies competing against one another. It's going to be ecosystems competing against one another.
Totally.
I'll pull my hippie card out for a minute. I hope someday that it's less competitive and more cooperative. Than we are right now. I think that's going to be part of our next evolution. More broadly. But we are expanding out, and if you were to compete as an ecosystem, you need the ability to connect through platforms and platforms of platforms. Otherwise, it's too point to point. Right. And you need to do it quickly. That's the thing. So that's the capability that we're seeing now in companies, is the ability to get the information, to be able to sense what's going on at a more granular level, and then to do some quick calculations on it, run the algorithms to say, is there anything different that we need to do as a result of that, whether that's on the demand side or the supply side?
Sure.
And that's sort of, a stair step on the way to having an autonomous type of supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't even talked about talent.
Right.
That's just a huge, it's a huge area of discussion today around automation, augmentation. What types of skills are required? Are we replacing people? What's our end game there?
Right.
Right now,
let me double click on that though, because you opened that door real quick. And that because we've talked about the breadth of supply chain, right? So not only do you have to have sort of a full scope? We've talked about diplomatic roles, but now you got data scientists, data lakes, data planning. IT planning, if you're going to get into robotics and IoT, and I mean, it's no longer just like, again, constraints theory.
Yeah.
You're really like running a full global business, including the technological aspects and innovation, because there's no handbook for this, right? A lot of it's being innovated sort of on the fly, which is the whole point of innovation. So you've got to have a particular mindset to be able to sort of live in that gray world that oftentimes historic supply chain practitioners, with all due respect, didn't have. They weren't conditioned to take on that risk, but that's changing too. So let's talk about talent. Like, it's a whole different person. I mean, a supply chain person is an entirely different person today. What do you see?
It is. You think about what we were talking about just earlier. You need to be a systems thinker. You need to have adaptability because things are changing more quickly now in the general environment. I think just an understanding of data and analytics and how to contextualize what's going on in business with those skills is really important. Those are some of the critical ones I would point to as far as talent. I think the companies that do this well, they couch or they frame their digital transformation in the context of, this is something that we're doing because our customers' requirements continue to escalate and we continue to run into these constraints from a supply perspective. So it's just becoming more complex.
Right.
And so we can't get there from where we're at today. We need more. We need to make you into bionic supply chain people. And we need you to use your time and your intelligence in ways that are uniquely human. So if you're a customer service rep, all that, drudgery that you would do, going and mining, data and moving it from system to system and all that. Well, we'll do that with RPA, and we'll do a lot of the stuff that you typically would do in a more automated way, and then you can actually work on that relationship with the customer,
right,
and add value that way. So I think, that's where we're headed, is more and more.
Well, one I was going to also poke on too a little bit is the mental shift from privacy, secrecy to more openness, transparency, and collaboration, right? Even in the role of running a supply chain organization, and I'm sure you see this even in your groups, where you can share best practices across your counterparts, across what are historically called competitors, but all of you achieve a lot of advantage that benefits everybody in an equal fashion. And the example I'd give kind of draws on both of our high-tech backgrounds, where you saw that in the infrastructure space, right? The Googles and the Microsofts, unbeknownst to most people, are highly collaborative in the background, right? I mean, I happen to come from that world, so I know all those folks. And we still talk every, at least 2-3 times a year. And you'd think Google, Joe Cava over there or Christian Bellotti over at Microsoft, they're best buds. But they're competitive at a corporate level, but they do talk about what they do at their infrastructure data center side. And I think it's benefited the whole industry. So the reason I draw on that example is I think supply chain practitioners can learn from that. Right? Yeah. You don't need to do it on your own. You can actually still retain your competitive nature, but share what you're doing at a supply chain best practice level.
Absolutely. There's always going to probably be some line where people are like, well, this is something I consider to be a competitive advantage. But I think that line is being pushed further and further along, just because the problems that we're needing to solve as individual companies, especially some of these larger, sustainability issues, it's like we will not get there unless we all collaborate. Like the example I was giving before on standards, it's a direct parallel to what you described in the high tech design of data centers. So
right.
that's part of that's a big part of the conversations that I'm in with the community today.
Oh, cool.
How to do that.
Well, let's. We've got a few minutes left, so I definitely want to be mindful of time. And as always, I look at the clock and I'm like, Jesus, an hour just flew by. Like, what the hell just happened? So we could go on for a long time, but let me just again kind of take a look forward. What are you seeing happening over these next few years? I mean, not only for you or just for supply chain in general. I mean, we've touched on a bunch of topics. Obviously, sustainability is big. Carbon accounting is out. Carbon accounting, for whatever that means, is going to come into play as an ingredients list or something. Digital twin seems to be a big deal. What are you seeing kind of as the big themes over the next few years within supply chain?
Yeah, I think the major underlying drivers will continue. So there's the customer requirements. I at least in the short run, on the B2C, it's I want it sooner. I want it reliably sooner.
Right.
If you're looking on the B2B side, it's I want things tailored just the way I want it. You mentioned before, some of the high tech examples around that as far as the products. Yeah. I may even want to buy what you sell as a subscription and not even buy, actual physical products from you anymore.
Right.
That will drive a tremendous amount of change because you have to run your supply chain in a much different way to do that. Sustainability, that just keeps, it's on a path, like this. I would say that in digital, in the digital space, the most common applications that we hear from people are around AI and machine learning.
Right.
And so it's like, well, where is that going to embed itself yet further into what we do, whether that's our planning or our sourcing? There's just interesting applications. And I think, the other thing that still is, the final chapters or the next chapters have not been written on is what's the future of work look like?
Yeah, right.
How are we gonna run our supply chains in this hybrid type of world?
Right.
That's a whole other thing that needs to be worked through by our organizations.
Totally. Well, let me ask. Okay, and I'm going to ask you a one that's also out there a little bit too, but it's one that I'm sort of keenly watching because it's an extension of supply chain. But where are you thinking about the space-based supply chain? Right. So I'm looking at SpaceX. I'm looking at Astra rockets, and even the CEO from Astra, a guy named Chris Kemp, who is an open source software guy, now rocket dude. He says, quite frankly, he's building a supply chain company. And I don't think we talk about that a lot because it's still a bit early. But honestly, that is exactly what it is. It is an extension of the human species supply chain to enable us to, go to the stars, right? Whether it's to a space station, to the moon, or eventually to Mars and beyond. Yeah. But at the moment, we don't know how to. We have to kind of bring our supply chain with it. It's like moving the military or something like that. Like you have to figure out supply chain lines. Has that even come up yet? Because that's a whole new realm of supply chain thinking that we're just beginning to develop.
What I would tell you is I don't hear that as much in kind of your standard Fortune 500 companies right now talking about that.
Sure.
But I think more broadly, just the advancement of humankind. Yeah, that's the next thing that we need to do, and I think our technology will take us there.
Awesome. Yeah, well, no, absolutely. And again, just want to be mindful of time. So this has been just an incredible conversation. Could go on for hours in this thing. Your insights are, again, just so uniquely positioned, both in what you've done in a career, but then also what you've been exposed to, and to be able to see this. And so I think that's just an awesome interpretation of what's going on. Great pleasure to speak with you. It was just a lot of fun. Hopefully we could do it again. I know we'll run across each other again, sure.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'd say, for the audience, if you don't work in supply chain and you're just watching this because you're curious, come join us where we're here running the world and trying to save it at the same time. And if you do, I guess just a big thank you because it's been a pretty tough slog over the last several years. But it's great work, and I'm honored to be part of this community. So. Appreciate your having me on to share some of that with you and your listeners.
Awesome, Stan. Well, really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
This is Richard Donaldson. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments about the episode or topics in supply chain you'd like us to explore, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at supplychainnext@requus.com. And while you're at it, why not check out the Requus platform at supplychain.requus.com. Requus allows you to manage the full asset lifecycle in the cloud, collaborating with your entire value network to buy, manage, and sell your assets. Find out more at www.requus.com.